Welcome, everyone, to Ask, Explore, Write, using inquiry to support science and literacy learning. We're so pleased to be presenting for the Educator Collaborative's Spring 2021 gathering, and we very much look forward to getting underway. We're going to get started first, though, by taking a moment for two acknowledgements. Today, if you were here with Jeremy and I in mid-Michigan, we'd be gathered on the beautiful lands maintained for generations by the Anishinaabe people, the indigenous inhabitants of Michigan, with whom we continue to partner with today at Central Michigan University. And as our connection to the Chippewa River Writing Project, and of course the Chippewa River here in mid-Michigan is an important part of our work together and our identity, we also think that it is important to acknowledge the relationship that the university has with the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe. We also want to take a moment to read a statement from one of our guiding professional organizations, the National Council of Teachers of English. This is from a blog post in 2019 that I think really summarizes some of the feelings and concerns that many of us have about the state of anti-racist education and what we as educators might need to do. So they say, being an anti-racist educator is a verb. As our nation seems to grapple with acts of hatred more frequently, we as educators must consider our actions. We need to consider where we've spoken and where we've been silent in terms of quelling the growing violence our country faces. These perpetrators were once our students. Our teaching must therefore be an act that addresses, challenges, and dismantles racism in all its forms. Anti-racist educators actively confront and challenge racism. And with that, I wanted to just again pause for a moment to say thank you to Chris, to Amy, to everyone in the Educator Collaborative for welcoming us here. My name is Troy Hicks. I'm a professor of English and Education and the director of the Chippewa River Writing Project at Central Michigan University. And I'll let my friend, colleague, and co-author Jeremy introduce himself real quick as well.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jeremy Hyler. I am a 6th and 7th grade English and science teacher at Fulton Schools in mid-Michigan. I'm literally out in the middle of a cornfield. And I have been with the Chippewa River Writing Project for the past 10 years. And I have co-authored 3 books with Troy, including the one we're going to gather and talk about today, which is Ask, Explore, Write. And I also want to extend my gratitude towards Amy and Chris for allowing us to go through with this presentation. So thank you, and we look forward to working with you today.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And as you just nodded, we are going to be talking today from some ideas that we shared in our book that came out right about this time last year. So maybe we didn't do as good a job with PR given all the other happenings in the world, but Routledge, IN Education released Ask, Explore, Write right towards the end of February, early March of 2020. We co-authored this book with one of our other friends and colleagues, William Pangle, who's a biology instructor at Central Michigan University, and we'll tell you just a little bit more about the story that led to the book and some of the activities we're going to describe today. But we also want to let you know that on Jeremy's website, you will be able to find links for all the chapters. So if you navigate your way to the Ask, Explore, Write section right there, you'd click there, and then you'll have drop downs for all the chapters. And then in the chapter subpages, you'll have links to all of the things that we mention in the book, and also some of the things we'll talk about during the presentation today. So do visit Jeremy's website, which hopefully will be linked from the session notes and materials for this video. And I wanted to just start by telling you a little bit about the journey that brought us to the start of working together on the book with Willeen, and to think about how we see the work of writing in science. We've probably heard lots of things over the years. For those of us that have been around the education block a few times, we've heard writing to learn, writing in the content areas, writing in the disciplines. There are so many different things that we've heard about. Disciplinary literacy really started to take hold in the aughts. And now whatever we call it, whatever we think about it, we know that writing and language is so important to the way that we understand science and the ways that we understand the world. And so I think that it's important just to share this opening quote from the book as we open our session today. We begin the book and the session with the assumption that writing is an integral part of science and that we only understand the world and the discipline of science through language. So with that, I'll tell you just a little tiny bit about the work that we do with our Beaver Island Institute. We are very proud to have had 4 summers, 2016, 17, 18, and 19, where we were able to take groups of about anywhere from say 12 to about 18 teachers, depending on the summer, to Central Michigan University's Beaver Island Biological Station. And at the station, we were able to do a number of different types of laboratory experiences, both at the station as well as out in the field. And then we were able to come back to the station, bring specimens of macroinvertebrates back to the lab. We were able to go out on the sand dunes and on the beaches and dig around in streams and ponds and things like that, and really put the teachers right in the mode of inquiry-driven science. And then we would come back, examine the data, dig into that data, and use some writing to learn strategies to explore it in more detail. And I'm sure that Jeremy will have a couple stories to tell about Beaver Island and some of the work too. So at this point, I'm going to kind of pause, and you'll hear from me again a little bit later on in the session, but we're definitely going to let Jeremy take over at this point so he can tell a little bit about his experience as a member of this facilitation team at Beaver Island, and then also what he does with his students in his classroom.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Troy, for that very awesome introduction. And yeah, I just want to echo a little bit what Troy said in terms of Beaver Island. It has been awesome to be able to be a part of that. You want to talk about a hands-on experience to be able to really dive into science and literacy. That experience as a facilitator and as a participant the very first year that they had it has been next to none. I compare it a lot to the Summer Institute for the National Writing Project and to the Chippewa River Writing Project. It's just professional development that you're not going to get anywhere else, and just the quality and the collaboration that you're able to get with in terms of someone from your own district, and as well as other teachers from around the state. And we actually had some teachers that have come from out of state too in the past as well. But the Beaver Island experience has really shaped what my science classroom looks like today, with help from Troy and help from the other facilitators, and from help from the expert in my school, which is who is Jeremy Windsor, and he is one of the other co-facilitators. And thankfully, I have the privilege of working with Jeremy and being able to make my science classroom even better. Between the things that I'm going to talk about today with infographics and digital notebooks, those things have come out of what the work that we have done on Beaver Island. So hopefully you can see some of the work, you understand some of the work that we've done through Beaver Island through the lessons that I show you today. So the first I want to talk about just a little bit about the overview of what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to talk to you about, like I said, infographics and notebooks, and Troy's going to talk about something called creative nonfiction. And I'm going to walk you through how infographics have really transformed my classroom, and I'm actually going to talk to you a little bit about how it was very helpful for me during this transition to online learning that we've had to do during the pandemic. And also talk to you about writer's notebooks and kind of show you what writer's notebooks could look like in a face-to-face classroom, and as well as what they could look like if you had to do more of a digital teaching because of COVID-19. And so, please make sure you hold tight for the lesson with Troy, because the creative nonfiction, it is next to none, and it's something that my students rave about, and it's something that I learned on Beaver Island, and so I know that Troy will do an awesome job with that, and it's a very worthwhile lesson to go through. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is going through visual explanations with infographics. And one of the first questions I always ask my students is, what is an infographic? And, and usually we get the typical student response of, oh, I don't know what they are. But then when you show them pictures, students are like, oh, yeah, I've seen those before. But one of the definitions that I've used is something that I wrote in my middle web blog post. I'm a middle web blogger, and there will be a link to that blog post available to you with the recording of this session. But I wrote that infographics are visual representations of data that are meant to display information in a quick and easy way for clear interpretation. We've probably all seen infographics before, and we've probably actually seen infographics that probably aren't so quick and aren't so clear in terms of interpretation. But I try to make this very clear to my students that this is something that we want our audience to be able to understand what it is that we're trying to tell them in terms of our message. So there's just a really quick definition for you to kind of guide you as we go through this lesson or this session. But then the next question is why? Why would I want to use infographics in my science classroom? And one of the reasons we want to use them is because it's building those literacy and those numeracy skills. Let's remember that science is math extended. It's just an extension of math. And so we still want to build on those numeracy skills that students are going to have based on math. But also, we want to make sure that the biggest thing that at least I see with my students is that when it comes to literacy, a lot of my students feel like once they leave the English classroom, that literacy is done, that they don't ever have to read anymore, they don't have to write, they don't have to follow any of the rules or anything like that. Well, we want to make sure that they understand that they have to carry those skills with them in every subject area that they are doing. And when we talk about cross curricular, we talk about disciplinary literacy. Those are the types of things we want to make sure we have our students understand, that those skills carry across the aisle no matter where they're going. We also want to make sure that we're helping students to be able to evaluate and synthesize data. A lot of times, if we give students a graph or if we give them an infographic, sometimes what one student sees, another student may have a completely different observation that another student doesn't. And so we want to make sure that they're evaluating this type of data correctly. And I hate to say it, but when it comes to more of those summative assessments that students do, it's really helpful if they can be able to pull out the information that they need to be able to answer questions correctly. Not that that's everything, but we want to make sure that they're able to do that. And infographics can be used both for, speaking of summative assessment, can both be used for formative and summative assessments. I really like the idea of using it for more of a formative assessment with my students, so I can kind of get a gauge of what they already know. And then later on, maybe implementing it as a summative assessment instead of giving them that basic multiple choice quiz or essay quiz that we might tend to give to students. Um, Infographics can reach a wider audience because we can put them out onto social media, whether that is something that I wrote in a blog that I just talked about earlier, or whether or not we put that out onto our social media pages or even our school website pages. And one of the projects that we do in our school with Salmon in the Classroom, we put a lot of information out there with infographics for our community to see in terms of what we're doing with the release of salmon back into the wild. And I know that Mr. Windsor, my colleague Jeremy that I mentioned earlier, he's doing some things with Rainbow Lake right now, which is a lake right by our school. And he's doing some studies and he's posting a lot of that stuff on his website. So it's very easy to share those things. And then it also gives students writing opportunities in our classroom. In our science classrooms, we want students to write across disciplines. And so this is an opportunity for them to write more in the science classroom. So one of the things that I do is with my students, is the very first thing I do is I give them an infographic. And this is the one I typically give them, even though it might be a couple years old. I think it's a really good one by the USDA. And you can actually click on this particular infographic. You can actually go to the website where it's from. But I always ask my students, what is it that you see? And so I would ask just to take a minute of your time right now and ask yourself, what is it that you see in this? And so some of the things that my students might say is that they see, pictures of cows, they see pictures of grocery store sacks, they see kids, they see schools. One of the notable things that I've had participants point out is that there actually is a road that goes from the barn all the way to the school. They notice that there's some information there in terms of statistics. There's some percentages. And so they're noticing lots of different things. And I would even have students go as basic as, is there a title? Ask them, is there a title for this? Do you see who this is from? Ask them, is it a reliable source that you're getting this from? And so just basically, trying to get your students to buy into the idea of infographics and what they are, and have them just pick out what it is that they notice. We want them to be very observant. And that's one of the key things that we want for students to do in science, is to be observant. And so we want them to be able to pick out as much as possible with this infographic. So the next step that I would have my students then do is we would talk about that title of the graph. And then we would have conversations about describing the pictures, and or maybe summarizing the information that they have within the graph. I might have them cite specific statistics or results that are included in the graph that I'm giving them, especially the one I just showed you. I might have them name the source. We just talked about where it's from, the USDA. And then I want them to also give me their opinions. I think this is a crucial step for students, to have them express what their opinion is about the graph, and express their opinions in a very, professional way in the classroom, that is not going to be insulting of the graph or insulting of other students' opinions, but having a very productive conversation about what is going on in that graph. And then the biggest one I always like to have my students is, how does this relate to you as a student? How does this information, does it impact you, or does it impact individuals that are around you? Because, most information that students are going to get through infographics, at some point it's going to impact them. They may not see it directly, but in some point it's going to impact them indirectly as well. So we try to get students, or at least I try to get students in my classroom to understand that. With something like this graph, and one of the reasons why I show it is because it could definitely impact them directly, especially because I teach in a farming community. Now, I will be honest, I don't see the farm to school impact directly, as a teacher, but students can see that how this could very well relate to them, especially with a lot of my students coming from farms. And you can see where I made a note at the bottom here on the slide where it says I could have them record in science notebooks, or you could simply just have a conversation with students, or you could break them into smaller groups and give them a hard copy, or if you're doing this online, then you put them into breakout rooms and have them discuss the graphs, and then you could come back as a group and have a bigger group discussion. So there's lots of different ways that you could maneuver this in a classroom, depending on whether you're face-to-face or you are online. And so I just come back to the graph once again. So spending some time talking with my students again, and having that group conversation about this particular graph. And like I said, you can access this graph through the link that I have provided by just clicking on the image in the presentation. So as students are diving deeper into infographics, and we talk about what is exactly included in an infographic. We talk about all these different things about, not only is there written words, or there's a title, or there might be images, but there might be some tables. There could be a line graph, there could be a pie graph, there could be a bar graph. And so here in this table, what I've done is outline some advantages, or I should say what we did in the book is we outlined this, because this comes directly from our book, is we outlined some advantages and some disadvantages of what would be beneficial or not so beneficial to have a table in an infographic, or a line graph, or a pie graph, or a bar graph. And I'm sure that we've all seen these different types of things included in an infographic. But then also on the right hand side, we've included some teaching points. I know that for me in science, I know one of the things that we talk a lot about in science is tables, and that tables are really good for storing information. And you're going to see one in not a writer's notebook, but a science notebook a little bit later on, as I show you a student example. Line graphs are really good for revealing those patterns quickly, and I work a lot with line graphs with my students, and my students always tend to go back to line graphs or bar graphs. That's the other one my students tend to lean towards a lot, especially bar graphs, because when I think about bar graphs, they're very much more of an elementary type thing, but not necessarily. But my students fall back on it because they're used to seeing bar graphs, so they're used to doing bar graphs. So line graphs and bar graphs kind of go hand in hand in terms of students falling back on them. That's the only way they go hand in hand. Just want to make that clear. But you can see some of those teaching points on the side in terms of For the line graph, we want to watch out for the proper scaling when students use line graphs. We want to make sure that in a bar graph, and I'll come back to the pie graph in just a minute, but in a bar graph that there need a conversation regarding meaningful categories, because lots of times students will just drop in things real quick because it's the easiest thing for them to do with a bar graph. We want to make sure we're having those conversations with students about making sure that this is the appropriate graph to use. And then when we talk about a pie graph, we're talking about very specific data. And I'll show you an example of that with some fish species that were pulled out of Fish Creek, which is where we put our salmon, release our salmon in the springtime. But there's very specific ways that we want to have our students use pie graphs. But this is just a very helpful table for you to be able to take a look at in terms of if you want students to implement these certain types of tables or other graphs into their infographic themselves. So some tools for infographics and using infographics. There are a number of tools here on the screen. There's links here on the screen. If I'm to pick two that are very useful for me, and I'll talk about another one that I've used in the past. But my students really like Visme this year, especially. They're really liking Visme and Pictochart. Pictochart has a number of different, in terms of inserting that line graph or that bar graph, you can use that with Pictochart. Visme has a lot of the kind of flashy stuff that students really like. I believe Visme and Pictochart are both freemiums, which means that they give you some free content, and then you have to pay for the more advanced stuff that they have on their websites. Now, the one that I've used in the past is Infogram. I used to use that one a lot with my students, but then again, it became a cost issue where they started taking more of the free stuff away and putting it more into their paid version. So but then you can check out the other ones too. And like any other teacher, we need time to play. So take time to play around with which one works for you, and have your students play around with these as well. I think that's important to let students have not only choice, but see which one is more comfortable for them to play around with, and give them an opportunity to use the ones they feel comfortable with. So speaking of Infogram, this is a infographic from Infogram that a student did in my class. Quite a few, I want to say quite a few years ago, probably 3 or 4 years ago. And again, this is when we do our salmon in the classroom project, where our students raise salmon every year from the egg, and they release them back into the wild in the springtime. And actually, we're getting pretty close to that. So probably in another month, our students will possibly, depending on COVID regulations, could be releasing salmon back into Fish Creek. But one year, our students did the release and completed this infographic. And so you can see it's more of a pie chart on the left-hand side of the screen here, and you can see the different colors represent the different species of fish back in 2017. And you can see that over here on the right hand side where I broke it up, you can see that there were over 61 different species that were documented. 19 different species that were documented. Over 61 fish were caught at that time. And then one of the things that the students noticed was that there was this high concentration of burbot. And if you're not a science geek, burbot is kind of like the freshwater cod of Michigan, and they tend to not come down below the 45th parallel too much. And so to see this high concentration of burbot that they had was very not concerning, but just very interesting to the individuals that we had from the DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality. And so they were kind of going to do some further studies as to why the burbot were coming so far down south. Yeah, they're very slimy fish, but they're very cool. And then also you can see that this is where we released they gave the state and the city of where they released where we release our fish. So this is a Pictochart. One of the things you could do in Pictochart, and this was just a kind of a template that I wanted to show you. And I thought this was appropriate, seeing how we're dealing with a COVID-19 and a virus right now. So And you can see that there you could do some different things with some representations of different charts here with population. And then you can also, I like the inclusiveness of the different writing sections, because that's what you would want your students to be able to practice with infographics, is having some writing as well as informational writing, as well as some pictures or some graphs that are telling the story. So this is just one thing you could do with Pictochart. And the last thing I just want to talk about was when we come to assessing. So if we're going to do a summative assessment of an infographic, we want to make sure that we're looking at so 5 key areas that I kind of focus on, and that is making sure that their data is properly represented, whether they're using a bar, table, or a pie chart, making sure that proper data was achieved, that they're not just going out on the internet and grabbing different information, but they actually have appropriate and accurate data. And that when they're doing an infographic, it's appealing. Sometimes if we look at infographics, they're very busy. And so there's just too much going on there. And so we want to make sure that we have, right kinds of fonts, we have right kinds of color, scale, and that comes with a creative edge. And this should really help your students that are really creative and want to do creative things in your classroom. So infographics can definitely help with that. And we want them to be easy to read. We want the information to be relayed to an audience very easily. And then telling that accurate and factual story. I think this is very important, and especially during a time of misinformation that's out there, we want to make sure that the information that they are relaying to people is very accurate, and where they're getting their information from is accurate as well. And then if they use any other forms of media, maybe if they implement a YouTube video into their infographic, making sure that that's done accurately and correctly. And they can also include some other different types of media in their animations, any kind of animations. Students play around with memes or GIFs, maybe if making sure it's appropriate that they put it in, it's an appropriate meme or GIF that they put in there. That's another thing that we want to make sure that they're doing well. And then you can click on the link in the presentation, the STEM Literacy Infographic rubric. That's a rubric that I follow, but it's one of those things where you want to adapt it to your classroom and making sure that it's something that fits your needs, and making sure that you take anything out of there that you don't want with your students, or adding anything that you need to add for your students. And that concludes the infographic section of my presentation. And so as we move forward, going into science notebooks, we're looking at making sure that we are connecting students to science and to literacy in more of an individualized manner with looking at science notebooks. And so when I think about science notebooks, these are the things that we thought about when we were writing Ask, Explore, Write, that they are a safe space for practice writing in an inherently personal manner. Now, you might be thinking that's more of an English thing that rather than a science thing, but no, really, science notebooks can be very personal too, because of the way people actually express their writing. More people may express things in pictures, more people may express things in words, charts, graphs. We just talked about all that stuff in infographics. So they could include more of those in their writing. But some of the pedagogy highlights that I want to say is that we want to make sure that the science notebooks are an opportunity for our science students to grow. And I always make sure that my science students take their notebook with them everywhere, whether it's a digital notebook or it's a physical notebook. We want them to take it everywhere. Whether they're taking it to English, social studies, they're taking it to the doctor's office, whatever. I want them to be very observant in the world, like I mentioned earlier. And so I want them to be able to grow. In order for them to grow, they've got to be writing in that thing all the time. Now, it doesn't mean that they're writing it 24/7, but anything that they observe that's science, to write it down in their science notebook. And then we also want to make sure we're using that for a track record of material. When I say that, or when we say that, we're thinking more along the lines of experiments, or if they're making hypotheses. If they're doing an experimental design and they're kind of running that experiment, they want to make sure they're recording it. And we do always do a really good job of talking about what other scientists have done in the past in terms of what Albert Einstein's books might have looked like, or what the Manhattan Project or any of those other types of examples that are out there, in terms of making sure that they see exactly how scientists have written in the past, and that scientists write all the time, but they also keep track of all their information so they don't lose it. And then that personalized view, kind of tying it back to the very beginning of making sure that's personal and they're doing what they want to do in it and what best reflects their learning, and what in terms of making sure that they can understand it, in what they're writing in terms of the tables or any of those other types of things that they're putting into it, making sure that that it's their own space that they're writing in. So one of the first things to make observations about the natural world is what we want students to do. Here's an example of just a student that wrote a picture, wrote a really quick blurb about a picture. Wrote a really quick blurb about a plant that they saw, and then they drew the picture, and then they kind of broke down what it looked like underneath a microscope in terms of those cell walls. So this is one observation that students made. And this wasn't anything in terms of them doing an experiment. This was just them making some observations about what they see based on what the plant looked like outside of the microscope, and then what it looked like underneath the microscope. And then the other thing is we want them to record data. I have my students, we do a lab very early on in the year where my students are coming up with an experimental design in terms of trying to grow radish plants. And so they're doing a control and a variable. And so they're recording their data. And this is just an example of them recording data, the steps that they're going to take or had taken. And then also, again, some visuals, some pictures. They're making it their own, so that they understand it and they can go back to it and understand it as well. To brainstorm about experimental design, again, going back to that radish experiment, you can see the student was writing everything out and what the results were going to be after they wrote everything out. So a science notebook can look like the last slide with pictures on it, or it can just look like pure writing as well. Again, it depends on the student and how they want to relay that information. And then the fourth thing, we want them to record notes on readings, lectures, and videos. So at least in my class, any of the videos that we watch are not just videos to kill time. They're videos that usually pertain to what we're doing in class. For example, my students on Friday just watched a video about the size of the Earth compared to different stars, and they didn't realize how small the Earth was compared to the biggest star, which would take about 1,100 years to go around in a plane. So I blew my students' minds right before they left for spring break, but they had to write down some information. And this doesn't reflect it in the picture you see, but they were writing down information about what they learned about the relative size of Earth compared to the stars that are in our universe. So that is going to propel them into what we do in terms of the modeling science that we do in my classroom. That's going to propel them when they go to create a whiteboard, that they have that information through the very short 4-minute video that we watched. So the slides that you just saw were slides that were dealing with paper and face-to-face kind of images if you're writing in a notebook. But what would happen if we had to do all virtual? Well, here is an example of a science notebook, and due to time, because I want to make sure Troy has time to go through his stuff, but this is an example of what a science notebook could look like just simply using Google Slides. And the link is there. If you click on the picture in the presentation, the link will, and we'll also provide the link for you, but you can make a copy of this. And it failed to, my brain has failed me in terms of remembering where this came from, other than I know that I got it from my colleague, Jeremy Windsor. So whoever created this and sent it out for the world to be able to use is awesome. It's just great. I want to give them all the props in the world for this because it's something that my students use, and it can be broken down very, very easily in terms of that science notebook. So I'll show you real quick. This is just an example pulled out of one of my students' science notebooks. The question was, how does a seed produce a true plant? And then they responded to it. So a very simple response to how a seed, how does a seed produce a true plant? Other than the fact that they didn't put a question mark here, I think it's a very well written response. And then this is from the same science notebook, student science notebook, where they did a data table when they were doing that radish experiment. And you can see that they recorded for 2 weeks what was going on in terms of what they were doing in that experimental design and that experiment that they did in class. So it was a very nice job in terms of them recording their data and having their data ready to go. So when they presented their whiteboard in the modeling instruction classroom, that they were able to have good data there. So, that's my part of the presentation. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Troy. But again, you can click on any of those resources on my website under the Ask, Explore, Write section, and I will hand it back over to Troy.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeremy. And yeah, I would just pick up on that idea that so many teachers have shared so many resources for virtual learning, and just finding so much support from others, building virtual notebooks and other templates and hyperdocs and great things that are out there. There are some slides places like Slides Go, Slides Carnival, things like that you can find similar types of tools. And we'll give a little love to Slides Carnival because that's the template we're using here in our presentation. But yeah, and in that spirit, I'll share my lesson here, and we'll put it out there. You'll get a bit.ly short link to the lesson that I'm about to share for creating creative nonfiction. And so I like to say that I've gotten some inspiration from some different places for this. We've always known that it's really difficult to get students to explore disciplinary concepts in detail, to get them to really articulate what it is that they know about a process or a phenomenon. And sometimes just changing the focus a little bit, coming at it from a slightly different angle, can be really powerful. And so I'm first inspired by the links down here on the second bullet point. Barry Lane has his Wacky Research book that came out in 2003 with so many different genres and opportunities for creating top 10 lists and wanted posters and all these different types of things. That was one early inspiration. And then in 2011, Tracy Gardner from Virginia Tech released a book about designing writing assignments. And in chapter 4 of that book, which you can follow the link there, and it's an openly available book, she has so many different audiences and purposes and formats that you might be able to pursue. So there are all those things. And then also, I am by no means an expert on creative nonfiction, but this quote from kind of the grandfather of creative nonfiction, Lee Gutkind, suggests that, we want to compel our readers to engage in these factual stories, but to do so much in the ways that we would a narrative. And so we're going to look at one of my favorite creative nonfiction writers, Bill Bryson. And one of the examples that we looked at this, in the context of the Beaver Island Institute, one of the ways that we did this was to say, let's think about these ideas of invasive species and how might we have our participants choose a different genre, represent something differently, and think about it. So we have two examples here. The one from Lexi in 2017, we were writing about the brown goby, or round goby, the goby something that was at the bottom of the lake that is an invasive species, even worse than some of the sea lampreys and things like that. So she wrote about this. We'd gone out on the vessel, the Chippewa, and got to look at the cameras under the water and see that. So she came back, and her nonfiction inspiration was to write about the invasion of these alien species. And from 2016, when we did this activity, we had gone out to the sand dunes, and we were talking about what happens at the beach, and then what happens when you get over that first crest and into the valley and then up towards the tree line. And Shannon Oswald did a series of 3 real estate posters describing the types of things that would happen and what kinds of plants might be attracted to the different areas. So there's lots of creative ways that you can do this. And the lesson that I'm going to share today is centered on Bill Bryson and the way that he uses a little bit of his British wit and humor to invite us into these explorations of these facts, but to do so in a humorous way. So the link down here, the bit.ly/creating-creative-non-fiction, I'll watch the caps there too. That will take you to a version of this document, which I'm going to launch into right now and walk you through. And it will be a view only document, so you can save a copy to your own drive. The idea behind this lesson is that we want students to be thinking about, again, how can we take some facts but look at them in a slightly different way, maybe bring a little bit of humor, maybe do something that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So the first text comes from a pretty straight up kind of fact based, typical nonfiction headings, images, captions, chunks of text. You could talk about all the nonfiction text features that are available here. And you can see all these different elements, embedded videos and things like that. And actually, we would at times want students to think about composing text like this. We want them to be able to create text like this. But, it is a little kind of dry. And so I took this chunk right here, the black bears and people, and I put that in here into the Google Doc. And so you would ask your students, all right, let's look at this. Let's do an analysis of this chunk of text. What are we going to do? We're going to look at those nonfiction text features. We're also going to be thinking about what I would call like the ratio of facts to words, like how many facts are presented in each sentence or in each paragraph. What are the most memorable phrases? And then what makes it memorable? So, they might go in and they might highlight, oh, they are shy and seldomly aggressive. Like we could call that one fact. And then unless they're feeling threatened, we could call that two facts. I mean, you can count with your students how you want to choose the number of facts exactly. If you encounter a black bear, stay calm and do not run. So is that one fact? Yeah, probably. Anyway, you count them and then you think about, all right, well, what's in here? What's interesting? What's compelling? But then is there a moment that makes it memorable? Is there a literary little flourish, or is there something in there that is interesting and compelling? And maybe they might find something that's like, oh yeah, that's kind of an interesting little sentence or turn of phrase. But then we want to pause and we want to say, okay, let's think about how we might present this in a slightly different way. And there is a segment of Bill Bryson's Walk in the Woods that is available online. And so you could go and of course you could read this whole segment if you wanted to, or you could scroll down again to the chunk about what happens with the black bears. And, I would go down and find that part. And, I've already copied and pasted it over here for us. So the idea is that you might also have them think about literary nonfiction. You could see like what are the elements of literary nonfiction, have them do a little exploration of that. And then we could be thinking about how Bill Bryson uses the fact. So that kind of fact to word or fact to sentence ratio, you could have them read and dig in and highlight a few things. But then also, where do you see literary elements? Where do you see things like simile, metaphor, personification, hyperbole, imagery? And how does that make you feel? And then also, more importantly, when we think about the more kind of straightforward, don't break the third or fourth wall or whatever that's called in theater type of perspective from the nonfiction, how does Bill Bryson really kind of speak directly to you as a reader? So, in contrast to something about what the bear might do, attacks are very rare, but when they happen is when the bear is on all fours with the head down. Most attacks take place when a person tries to feed or pet the bear because the bears get frightened easily. I'm kind of using my boring nonfiction tone. But now, if we were to read Bill Bryson's piece, if I were to be pawed and chewed, and this seemed to me entirely possible, the more I read, it would likely be by a black bear, Ursus americanus. There are at least 500,000 black bears in North America, et cetera, et cetera. And you read on and you read on, and then you're saying black bears rarely attack. But here's the thing, sometimes they do. And you can kind of go from there. So where is he using humor? Where is he using sarcasm? Where is he using hyperbole? How is he introducing these facts? So he's mentioning, the same types of things. Black bears will rarely attack, but They could. And then he goes on to reiterate that they don't happen often. And he talked about, the limited number of killings, but that hasn't really assuaged his own fears about going on this hike on the Appalachian Trail. So with all that in mind, then we push students to the next and final step. So we want them to create their own creative nonfiction. We want them to do some research, and it could be an animal, it could be some other scientific phenomenon. When we've done this on Beaver Island, we've typically tried to steer them more toward the animals. But as you see, Shannon wrote about plants, and that was fine too. But we get there. There are some links here again to the Barry Lane resources and Tracy Gardner's resources. But then I took a couple of Bryson sentences and I just turned them almost in a they say, I say kind of sentence template style. If you were to be blank and blank, and this seemed to me to be entirely possible, the more I read, it would be by a blank. So, rather than being pawed and chewed by a black bear, maybe it's something else that would happen if you were to encounter an octopus or some other kind of animal. There are at least so many blanks in the blank. So they could think about population size and so forth. And then, such and such will rarely do what? Will rarely spot humans or will rarely attack like the black bear, or you could do something else. So the idea here is that students would take these, they would, copy these, and then they would drop them in here and they would create their own creative nonfiction. So this template is available to you. I put it out under Creative Commons, noting that I'm using fair use provisions for the text that I've borrowed from these other websites and Bill Bryson's resources. But there's the creating creative nonfiction lesson. And with that, and knowing that our time here is coming soon to a close, I'm going to push us back into the slide deck and welcome Jeremy here to share a few kind of closing words as well. But when we think about the new frontiers of science and writing, we close the book by then saying we believe that the process of asking, exploring, and writing can help our students adopt the skills and dispositions that they need to be scientifically literate now and in the future. So welcoming them to use writing in so many different ways to build inquiry into all our lessons provides them with all these new opportunities. And there is our contact information again, and I will share just a little bit more. You're getting this message on April 10th, 2021, and this summer of 2021, the Chippewa River Writing Project has a couple of institutes and options available for you. We have our Summer Institute that will be a 2-week morning on Zoom institute that has a scholarship available that closes on April 16th. So if you're watching this on April 10th, you've got just a few days to get in there and fill out a scholarship application generously supported by the NEA Foundation. And you can find the links here on the slide deck to these resources, or you could also go to ChippewaRiverWP.org. And then also we have a number of open institutes that are fee-based, but are available at different points throughout the entire summer. Jeremy's leading one of these, I'm leading one of these, different teacher leaders will be involved in all of these, and we would welcome you to explore those as well. So with that in mind, and as I said, giving a little bit of love to Slides Carnival, I'll go back to the slide that has our contact information. And Jeremy, you get the final words. What would you like to say as we think about this process of asking, exploring, and writing?
Well, thank you, Troy. I appreciate it. I think the words that I would like to leave you with is that this, if there was a time, now is the time for all of us to be innovative and to think of creative ways that we can implement more writing and reading into our discipline and cross curricular. And so I challenge you to get with a colleague that might be an English teacher, or if you're an English teacher, get with a colleague that's a science teacher, and just come up with some innovative ways that you can include more writing across those disciplines.
Well, on behalf of Jeremy, and again with thanks to Chris and Amy and everyone at the Ed Collab for this opportunity, we appreciate you viewing our Anytime Learning for the Spring 2021 gathering, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future. Thanks.